Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today I'll be adding a new section to the page. I'm just going to insert this new page and call it Museums, and adjust its position so it's the third tab that you select. Now this started off as a blank page, so I'm then going to add a pre-built intro and change that to recommended museums, because this page is going to be where I'm going to put all the museums and museum ships that I visited and I can recommend that you visit in turn. So far, I don't think I've visited any that I wouldn't recommend, but obviously each of these is a personal recommendation because I've been there, I can verify it's really good. And then we're going to select another section, a blank section underneath, at least to start with. And I'm going to start off with a section on Scandinavia from the most recent trip. So just copying all the links to the museums, at least the ones I can remember off the top of my head immediately, along with little titles to tell you where they are. Go through and make them all hyperlinks very quickly because it doesn't default hyperlink, which is quite a useful feature, believe it or not. And once that's done, then, well, there you are. Just change the background picture to something a bit more naval themed, and the page is ready to go. And I will eventually show you how to add pictures and map locations, etc., as I expand this list of museums to visit. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show.
Hello everybody, and welcome to another Wednesday video. This week we are talking with a special guest, as you probably guessed from the fact that there is one. No, that way. This is Ron Drabkin, everybody, and he is going to talk to us about naval aviation in World War One and critically after World War One, and essentially how the Imperial Japanese Navy's air service became the Imperial Japanese Navy's air service, and how the Royal Navy and ex-Royal Navy officers were involved in that. So, with that tantalizing little glimpse unveiled, as it were, would you perhaps like to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've ended up with all this information? Do you have a book?
Yes, hi, I'm Ron Drapkin, calling in from Tokyo here. I'm an IT guy by trade, but I've done quite a bit of this naval history, and in particular got involved in writing this biography of Frederick Rutland, the World War I British hero turned Japanese advisor and then spy. And really the interesting thing was that so much of the key information was declassified over the last 10, 20 years, especially in the pre-war period, pre-World War II period. As well as there's a lot of just Japanese information that's never really got out there. If you read the, if you read Wikipedia on the Japanese Imperial Japanese Navy, you get really a lot of things that are just absolutely not correct. And I work in Japan with a couple folks from the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, as they call themselves today. And these guys are great. They've got books from early memoirs just piled up at their houses, and they just love the stuff. So I'm taking advantage of a lot of their great research.
Fair enough. I mean, that's something we've definitely come across in a few other cases when it comes to the Japanese Navy in World War One into World War Two. There's often certain things said in English literature that are almost gospel now because they've just been repeated for 60, 70, 80 years. And then it turns out that actually that's all based either purely on, Allied assessments of things, which are not necessarily always correct, or, the one Japanese book that happened to have been translated into English, and then someone talks to people in Japan, like John Marshall did for Shattered Sword, and all the Japanese people go, yeah, no one listens to that guy. That's completely wrong. All of this stuff, however.
Yeah, for sure.
So to set the scene a little bit, starting off with, I guess, naval aviation or the Royal Navy in World War One, how does the Royal Navy start to adopt aircraft aboard ships during the First World War?
Yeah, it's the first things were, of course, seaplane carriers. And the question is, the question you don't want to ask is what was the first aircraft carrier? Because then you get about 20 different answers. But basically, the first Royal Navy planes were of course seaplanes with floats, not wheeled, and you could keep like 2 or 3 or 4 in a hangar on the deck of an old Channel steamer. And when you wanted to go out and do your reconnaissance, you'd pull it out of the hangar, and you'd put the pilot and the observer in in their respective seats. You'd get a crane, and you'd kind of winch them over the side, stopping the ship completely, of course, which is kind of a problem when you're sailing in a formation, right? And it would take about 20 minutes typically to get these ships over the side and taking off, and they go fly off and then hopefully find their way back.
Yeah, and it's a rather interesting thing because I get as much as we talk about a lot of misinformation about the Japanese Navy, there's also a lot of misinformation out there about the Royal Navy and their adoption of new technology. You often see quite a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, the Royal Navy really hated submarines; they didn't want to adopt them, etc." And then you look at the sheer number of submarines the Royal Navy actually has by the beginning of the First World War, and one of the first things they do is lots more of those, please.
Yeah.
So that this idea that the Royal Navy circa 1914 is some kind of technological dinosaur that doesn't want to adopt new technology really is incorrect. And as you mentioned, with
Mhm.
they've been experimenting pre-war with these newfangled aircraft, which, let's be fair, 1900s aircraft are not long range, not very reliable, incredibly fragile, and that's if you're on land, let alone
Yeah.
if you then take them to sea and subject them to salt water all the time. But still, they're subordinating, as you said, cross-channel ferries and all sorts of things to see what can we stick aircraft on and how can we use it. And they're constantly adapting as well, which obviously brings us to our second question, I guess, because by the time of 1916, I mean, we're only talking a couple of years into the war.
Mhm.
The Grand Fleet has two, if you like, aircraft carrying vessels assigned
Right.
to it. So you've got Campania with the Grand Fleet and Engadine with the battle cruiser fleet. When the order to sail comes, unfortunately, Campania doesn't get the order to sail until a couple of hours after everybody else has left. You kind of think they've noticed a couple of dozen battleships just tootling out, but there you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
She tries to catch up. She's actually is closing in because she's going full speed and the Grand Fleet's going cruising speed. But because they think there are German U-boats in the area, the Grand Fleet says no, no, turn back, which I think is a little unfortunate because Campania of the two is the much bigger, much better equipped
Mhm.
vessel. And like you said, the initial efforts for seaplanes are training them off, dropping them in. Campania has a launch rail, a launch ramp, one of the first. So she, in theory, can actually launch seaplanes on the go, and she has 4 short 184s, which technically are torpedo bombers,
Mhm.
although often used for recon, which does bring up the rather hilarious alternate timeline of, Shear trying to do the gun line thing and moving away from the Grand Fleet and then coming under random attack from torpedo bombers, which is not something you associate with Jutland.
Yeah.
Um, But Engadine does sail with
Mhm.
the battle cruiser fleet. She's a little bit smaller, only has 4 aircraft aboard. So what happens with her?
Mhm. Yeah, so the folks on there, with it's the Engadines with the battle cruiser fleet, and the weather is not good, as tends to be in the North Sea, such that if it hadn't been in a wartime, battle, they probably wouldn't have sailed. But they said, okay, let's, Beatty says, okay, launch a plane, and I just find this a little bit hilarious that you've got on one side 150 ships. Another side, you got 99 ships, and with 150 ships, you have even one airplane flying, right?
Yeah.
So, sticks and straw kind of thing. And Frederick Rutland is chosen as the pilot for this one. For this mission, he's the most qualified guy. Partly because he's a good pilot. He's not the best of all pilots, but he is the best engineer of all the pilots,
Mm.
and these things will be breaking. And so this makes him the ideal candidate, right? So the Engadine comes to a stop. Their orders are go find the Germans and tell us where they are. And he flies off and with his radio operator, and it's not hard to find them. There's all this smoke and gunfire going on, right? And he says, "Okay, there they are," and he has his radio officer. He repeats what he's going to say. We have 12 ships going this way, and the guy repeats it back, and then taps it out and says they're going this way, and then the Germans are like, "Hey, check that out," and they all start shooting. They all miss. He says their shooting is quite good. I'm assuming they haven't really gotten a lot of experience at shooting at planes. Maybe every gun in the German fleet shooting at them was a little bit of an exaggeration. But anyway, the Germans miss. But they change direction. He's like, "Oh, holy moly!" Okay, start all over again, right? Yeah, they just turn this way, and yeah, sends it back. And at that point, his job is basically done, and naval history is made. Frederick Rutland is gone, and he's told the fleet where the enemy fleet is, right? And he flies back towards the British fleet, and he's halfway there, and his plane craps out and dies. Right, the engines break, which is not uncommon at all, right? So he
Yes.
puts it down. What's unusual is that he's come down on a seaplane directly between the two largest surface battle fleets, battle ever. And so just imagine your plane is down there, and these shells are flying overhead that are, some of them are half the weight of your entire plane. And he, climbs out onto the float, and he fiddles with it, and he finds a problem with the fuel line, and cuts a piece off his rubber suit and sticks it on there, and he flies back, and history is made. Now, what did the British do with this information? Well, apparently not very much.
Yeah,
There was a lot
Beatty
of
not doing much with
communication.
information and signaling it. What a shock.
Yeah. He's telling them where the Germans are, right?
Mm.
Which anyway. Anyway, but the point being is that the people who know realize that history has been made, and this is an unarmed plane. They didn't do much with the information, but this is history. You can see putting a torpedo on this, a bomb on this, sending out 10 more, 20 more, 30 more, and then you kind of see where we're going over the next 20 years.
Yeah, it always, as you say, the idea of somebody in this little wooden canvas float plane, probably hoping the floats haven't got any shrapnel holes or anything in them, desperately trying to fix it, just standing there in the middle of the North Sea, bobbing up and down whilst everybody's shooting each other to pieces is highly amusing. Yeah, you've also got, as you mentioned, the Germans do have anti-aircraft guns. Both sides have anti-aircraft guns at this point, which is, again, a little bit interesting considering that it's only, again, 2 years into the war, the first combat uses of aircraft. Um, the Germans are using the 88 millimeter, kind of the standard anti-aircraft gun for the Germans for about, 3 decades.
Yeah.
But as you say, we're talking about manually aimed medium caliber anti-aircraft guns verging on heavy caliber. The chances of actually hitting anything, especially considering that at best you've maybe got to guess the timing on a timed fuse,
Mhm.
it is very unlikely you're actually going to hit anything smaller than a Zeppelin. And all the Zeppelins that they're out there scouting on the German side, so they don't want to be shooting at those.
Yeah.
But I am reminded of in the Adriatic a year or two before that there actually had been a big airship going
Hmm.
around. I think it was an Italian one, and it ended up in a gunfight with an Austro-Hungarian ship that had roughly the same amount of
Hmm.
not dedicated anti-aircraft guns, but anti-aircraft usable guns. And even with a target that big, they're kind of trading shots occasionally. The Zeppelins occasionally popping in to drop a bomb. The Austro-Hungarian ship's taking pot shots with I think it's like a 3-inch gun, and neither side hits the other. It's just this slow motion duel of hapless flailing giants. When you compare that to all the intricacy that's gone into range finding and fire control for surface control solutions. So we've got history made. We've got our first aerial recon of a battle going on. How does the Royal Navy then take that? And they've got these little seaplane carriers. How do they progress their naval aviation post Jutland through to the end of World War One and the end of the decade?
Yeah, that's broadly speaking, you're moving away from seaplanes onto wheeled planes. is the big thing. You know, the seaplanes with those floats, they look so cool, right? I love the
Mm.
look of them, but they just don't let the plane get very high. And you know, they're basically realizing we need to take down these Zeppelins, and we can't do it with a float plane. And wheeled planes are the way to go. So there's that. There's um, putting more armament onto the planes, making them better performing ones, moving to stop with pop goes next, and then and such like this. So I don't know, are we getting into the problems with landing here, Alex? I'm
Yeah.
just
Well, I mean, yeah, because I suppose at that point you've got, you're moving on to fixed landing gear, wheeled aircraft. You've got one of the things I always like to point out is that by the end of World War One, they've also
Mhm,
stuck lots of little launch platforms on the turrets of the ships of the Grand Fleet, which
mhm.
they're one shot. They're essentially vaguely analogous to the cam ships of World War Two, except without the rockets. So you launch these fighters, you're not getting them back. You'll get the pilot back, hopefully, but that's about it. But by the end of World War One, the Grand Fleet can actually put up about 140, 150 fighters if they wanted to, if everybody launches every aircraft they've got sat on their turrets. It's just you'll have that massive fighter defense cloud for about an hour or two, and then everyone runs out of fuel, and then you don't have anything. But of course, you've got Argus being converted out of an old liner,
Mhm.
Eagle being converted out of a Chilean battleship, Furious going through about 16 different stages of design and redesign.
Yep.
Um, and they're learning how to actually land aircraft on flight decks. They're learning about, should we have a superstructure? If so, where should that superstructure go? How big should it be?
Mhm.
Um, they managed to avoid the worst of the potential errors because at one point when they're looking at Eagle, they're thinking about putting two massive island superstructures down each side with gantries overhead, which would basically mean you have to land in a tunnel.
Right.
And fortunately, somebody goes, should we check that in a wind tunnel first? And then they realize that's possibly the single worst way of generating turbulence. Which, yeah, when your aircraft is so lightweight, I mean, this is going over to the trenches, but they're
Mm.
roughly the similar kind of aircraft. I'm reminded of the fact about I think it was 1915 or 1916. And I have seen some very grainy footage of this. There was somebody, a British pilot, flying along, and a
Mm.
German anti-aircraft gun landed a solid shot on him, hit the engine, and hit the engine hard enough. So it probably was an 88 or something like that. But hit the engine hard enough, it ripped the engine and the propeller clean out of
Mm.
the aircraft, basically blew the nose off. So the pilot's left almost comic style, flying two-thirds of an aircraft, but with no engine. Um, but the engine is such a substantial portion of the weight of these wooden canvas things that
Yeah.
he's now faced with, well, I don't have a parachute because they've not been issued at this stage. So I guess I'm crashing. But without that front weight of the engine, the aircraft is so light, instead of crashing, it floats down like a little sycamore
Right.
seed and
Yeah.
everybody's kind of watching it and both sides both like soldiers on both sides record everyone kind of stops firing for the next 5 minutes watching this aircraft gradually gently spiral out and everybody's putting small bets on where they think he's going to land and then when he kind of splashes down into a water-filled crater in no man's land. There's this big cheer, and everybody lets him get out of the firing line, and then they go back shooting each other. Um, but that gives you some idea, like just how fragile and lightweight some of these early aircraft are. So you really do not want to put them in a situation of trying to land with low engine power, with huge amounts of turbulence in their face. Um, but that's the Royal Navy for you. They're having fun experimenting with things, and a few people going over the side. But
More than a
that
yeah.
that means that when we get to the end of the decade, we've got the Royal Navy with a variety of aircraft carriers in various states of conversion and
Mhm.
completion. We've got Vindictive as a heavy cruiser. Well, what would become called a heavy cruiser has been converted into a kind of half carrier, half cruiser. Um, she's running around terrorizing Bolsheviks in the in the Baltic. Um, and this leaves us with this slightly weird situation in that the Royal Navy is now the Navy with the single greatest level of experience in operating
Mhm.
aircraft at sea. They actually have a plan, as I've mentioned a few times before on the channel, to launch a mass 100+ torpedo bomber strike on the high seas fleet that would put Pearl Harbor to shame. But they don't go through with it because in 1918 they don't have enough aircraft because stop with the delayed manufacture of the Cuckoo. And they're like, okay, right, great, we'll go for them in spring 1919, and then the war ends, and everybody's very sad. Well, virtually nobody's very sad the war's end, but that one guy who was planning the raid, it's like, oh, my precious raid. I wanted that so badly. And then, of course, we have the 1920s. The
Mhm.
Anglo-Japanese alliance is technically still on for
Yep.
the first couple of years, and of course, the Japanese are going, "Oh, new technology. We like new technology." But of course, they've operated a seaplane carrier or two of their own, but they have no real idea about fixed-wing naval aviation off of flight decks and this kind of thing. But of course, if your ally does, why not ask your ally for help? So at the same time, you've got the developing arms race and the situation that's going to lead up to the Washington Naval Treaty. So in all of this, we end up with what's called the Semple mission in 1921. How does that come about? Is it a case of the Japanese just rocking up and going, "Hey, we'd like to learn about aircraft carriers," and the Royal Navy going, "Sure, have stuff," or are they a little bit more reticent about giving away the crown jewels of the latest naval technology?
Yeah, the British are definitely more than a little bit reticent about this. And the Japanese, their decision that the Royal Navy is the best navy to be influenced and be trained by is not an uninformed decision, right?
Hmm.
They've had folks in Britain watching World War One with, one of the Japanese observers was actually killed at Jutland
Mhm.
when the Queen Mary went up. And they benchmarked it. They've said, like, geez, these planes don't land very well. The British are able to, they pulled the data, British are landing, safely X% of the time. And they asked their folks in Italy and, in France, like, what numbers do you see? And it's like, yes, the British have the best technology for sure. They're their historical allies. The Japanese have opened a little office in Westminster where they've got a couple of their best folks, and they're lobbying. They're saying, "Look, we need more help." As you say, they've created a aircraft carrier, the whole
Mhm.
show, and they just don't know how to run it. They don't know how to do it. The planes aren't working. And at that point, they're doing some naval aviation, but it's basically all British, right?
Mhm.
So the planes, are Sopwiths. The pilots are British. Yeah, they've hired this fellow Herbert Smith, who was the head designer at Sopwith. Sopwith started losing money,
Mhm.
going out of business. Yeah, and they need more help. And the British initially say no more than once about this. Yes, Japan's historical ally, but they're getting stronger and stronger to the extent that it's a little bit nerve-wracking. However, you've got Sopwith going out of business. You've got all these British aircraft manufacturers, losing money. The technological lead that they have is at risk because you're not spending money, but Britain doesn't have a lot of money, right? And so the Semple mission is sold to Britain partly as a way to keep the manufacturers alive. We can sell the Japanese a lot of our planes, right? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got Semple himself, head of the
Yep.
mission, goes over. Where does Rutland get involved in all of this? And what are some of the details of the information that between them, Rutland, Semple, and Smith are imparting to the Japanese Navy to help them develop their naval aviation capacity?
Yeah. So, Smith is very simply at the Mitsubishi plant helping them tune these planes, and make them better. So his role is, quite clear. Semple has a quite a large crew with him, about 20 British aviators and other specialists. This is the torpedo fellow. This is so on. Semple himself is probably not, from the Japanese perspective, not the best guy to lead this. He's as we Americans would say, is a bit of a cowboy.
Mhm.
What you're really looking for is a tactician and an engineer, not a star pilot, right?
Mhm.
And he is not an engineer, and he's really not much of a tactician, either. So the Japanese need to, with the treaty coming in, the British alliance is over, and the Semple mission goes home. And right at this time, Mr. Rutland's having some problems with the merged RENS and the new Royal Air Force, where they say to him, look, you're quite the technician, but you're not really the guy who's going to get promoted here. They don't mention his lower class background as much, but it's implied. They also say, well, how many Germans did you shoot down during the war? And the answer is, of course, none. He was flying an unarmed plane.
Yeah, a little bit difficult.
That wasn't really the point.
Mm.
And he gets really frustrated and angry about this. And he walks into this office in Westminster, where there's a couple of the Japanese officers are on duty, and they're charged with getting more information, especially as the Semple mission is winding up. And he says, I'd like to speak with you. My name is Rutland. And they say, we know exactly who you are, and please come in. And they arrange for him to to go over to Japan to be an advisor. They realize that the British, the Royal Air Force, is never going to approve of him becoming an advisor to the Imperial Japanese Navy. So they come up with a subterfuge, which is he'll be working for Mitsubishi. The British, this was really transparent, but the British didn't seem to understand that. In the Japanese sources, it's quite clear. They're like, we told them he'd be working for Mitsubishi. They bought him, right? And when he goes over there, he's actually put in Kamakura. So all the other Americans, British, French, are all living in a foreign colony, and they can't do this, right? Because they would know the word get around what he's actually doing. So they use the excuse of, well, the housing stock's a little weak. They had an earthquake, and they stick him by the beach in a nice place, quite over by Yokosuka, the main Japanese air base. Okay. And in this Kamakura area, this is where the Japanese admirals lived then, and it's where the head Japanese naval folks live, even today. It's over the hill in a little bit nicer area, right? The Japanese officers are in plain clothes. They go by his house at least twice a week. They have him over to Yokosuka. He actually gets onto the Hosho, and he's basically helping them with, the actual tactics. How do you pull off a landing? And the technology behind it, which is, more important. Little things like the hydraulic landing gear. It's just very important. When the planes are landing and they're bouncing and they're flying over the side, it's like, well, hydraulics are good. The resting gear and the wires are also very important. The Japanese copy the British, what do you call it? The wires going on the side as opposed to the front. Right? And they're making all this sort of progress there. Now, at the same time as Rutland is going over, there's a young Japanese officer that's been sent to the US to study named Yamamoto, right? And he comes back right at the same time Rutland gets there, and they put him in charge of the air group for training. So you have the technology coming in from Rutland, and Yamamoto is obviously a key player here as well. And he's taking the air group away from the sort of cowboy, the Japanese word is shokunin, which translates to artisan. So these pilots, they'd show up, they knew they're risking their lives every day. And like Semple, they are just going to be, and they're just going to do it. And they're going to power through and risk death and be heroic. And he's like, no. Let's make this a systematic process. Okay. We're going to look at the data. I'm going to figure out the best way to do these things. And they put this all together. And within a year or two after Rutland gets there, the planes are all of a sudden Japanese made, thanks to some help from Smith, right? Some Mitsubishis, right? The pilots are now, Japanese, right? Like the fact that Semple was flying a Sopwith Cuckoo around the Japanese shore and launching torpedoes is all very impressive, but it didn't help the Japanese quite as much, right?
Yeah.
And the engines are still the British Napier Lion engines, but it's pretty much you have a working carrier strike force, after a couple of years here.
Yeah, and the Japanese taking obviously the same approach they've taken with capital ships of getting in what they thought was the latest and greatest in technology, but then very rapidly adapting it and then designing their own versions and then moving on from that
Right.
for their own derivatives, for their own uses. And just for everybody's reference, when we're talking about Rutland's cover story of going to work for Mitsubishi, it's even more transparent than you might think, because these days most people associate Mitsubishi with cars and trucks and that kind of thing. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, however,
Mhm.
built a substantial portion of the Imperial Japanese Navy and would also build quite a lot of aircraft and aircraft components going forward. So they were at that time much more of an arms and heavy industry manufacturer than perhaps you'd think about these days. Although, to be fair, these days Mitsubishi still does build a fair amount of Japanese maritime self-defense stuff. Um, they're kind of like they're a bit like Samsung in Korea.
Yeah.
That they build almost everything. It's like, do you want a car? Yes. Do you want a calculator? Yes. Do you want bits of a plane? Yes. Can I buy a tank? Well, would you really know? We've got everything. Um, but yeah, and of course with the landing gear, again, we're talking about really early aircraft. Yes, it's the 1920s, but the first flight was, someone who was born when the Wright brothers first took off still technically isn't old enough to fly in an Air Force at this stage. And having fixed landing gear, i.e., they don't retract, that's fine. That will be the case for aircraft for quite a while for a lot of them. But the very earliest, obviously, is just some struts with some wheels on them. If you try and
Mhm.
land on an aircraft carrier with fixed landing gear like that, the best case scenario, you're going to pancake as they collapse. Worst case scenario, those struts are going to punch straight up through your aircraft and possibly through you. Um, and as you say, if you have very bouncy, nice Olean landing gear, you're coming down hard on an aircraft carrier, so you will come down hard and then you will bounce away, and then you will run out of flight deck and airspeed, and then it all gets very sad. So you need a nice balance of, usually, as you said, as you said, hydraulic-based landing gear where they can take the impact without snapping because they're not accepting the impact all at once; they're distributing it over time, but they're also hopefully not bouncing you too hard. And then assume once you've got that nice little window of landing gear set up, then assuming you can make the right approach at the right speed and get the arrestor hooks and everything else, you should stay on the deck. um, Although it's still a fine art. I mean, there's still a lot of film footage from the interwar period and even the Second World War where you see even fairly modern stuff like sea fires and wildcats and hellcats and so forth coming in, and it all looks great in slow motion until you see them boing up and over all the arrestor wires. And in some of the higher definition stuff, you can almost see the look of regret on the pilot's face as they realize they're heading at about 60 to 80 knots straight for the island at about 20 feet. Um, yeah, and then you discover that even all metal aircraft are not very solid when you smack into a aircraft carrier's island. They tend to wrap, and not in the best way. So Rutland's spent his the early part of the 1920s helping the Japanese become a naval aviation power, but then somehow he ends up in the United States. Um, but somehow also working now directly for the Japanese Navy, but not openly per se. So how does that come about, and what's he doing at that stage?
Yeah. So fast forward, about six, 7, 8 years here. All of a sudden, you're about 1930, and the plane technology, you're still flying biplanes, and they're wooden, and you're rapidly approaching. The designs are there. It's aluminum monoplanes and larger engines, and the technology is sort of accelerating. I would say in the late 30s, and the Japanese send some spies over to check things out and buy some beers for drunken sailors on the waterfront, and they're just not really getting the information they need. And the Russians and the Germans are right. The Russians are easily able to find communist believers, in California, geez, right? And the Germans are finding all these, German nationals that have gone over to the U.S. after World War I, find work, and they can hire them. And the Japanese just really don't have this ability to do this, right? And they're sitting around one day and they're like, gee, wish we had someone like Rutland again to advise us. And they're like, what is he doing? And I was to call him back up and say, he's working for his brother-in-law's company, bored to death in London. And they say, we have a job for you again. And he's, bored to tears, as a salesman. And they say, we'd like you to go to Hollywood. And he's very eager to take their money again. But he's like, I've got a family. Tell me more. And by the way, I'm very expensive. You've always treated me well. And we like to continue this. And they convince him, they're like you go to Hollywood, a lot of the early, movie stars were all British. Everyone from Charlie Chaplin and Boris Karloff and Nigel Bruce. He's like, you'll fit in great there. You'll fit in great,
Yeah.
and just all we need you to do is nothing illegal here. It's perfectly legal. You just be our advisor on technology, and the slippery slope commences, right?
Yeah. And for those of you who might be wondering why Hollywood, well, bear in mind where Hollywood is. Southwestern California. This is the interwar period. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is not based in Pearl Harbor. That only happens actually in 1940-41. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is scattered. I mean, it's theoretically mostly based in San Diego, but it's scattered between San Diego, LA, and San Francisco. So if you're in Hollywood, you're within relatively easy distance of pretty much the entirety of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And by the 1930s, the US has Lexington, Saratoga, Langley, if anybody cares to investigate her. They're in the process of, well, they will eventually be building the Yorktowns, and given the Japanese are now thinking about the Americans as their primary opposition, well, where better to base somebody to keep an eye on what the Americans are doing? Plus, of course, as you said, there's a strong British enclave there, so if he's still got contacts back at home, he can always relay that information. So is that pretty much what he's doing, kind of observing, relaying information, giving them advice based on what's going on over in if you like the Western world?
Initially, yes, but of course, it starts going more and more towards aviation as we
Mhm.
go. So around this time, Southern California, where I'm from,
Mhm.
it's sunny every day. We barely even have rain. And if you're developing new aircraft, this is very, very convenient, right? You don't have to worry
Mhm.
about fog or anything. So all the aircraft manufacturers are moving out there as well. And the key aircraft manufacturers, Consolidated, Douglas, and Lockheed are all there. Everyone but Boeing basically is there.
Okay.
And these aircraft designs, aircraft tactics are all, highly, highly of interest, right?
Yeah, and of course, if you're flying a prototype aircraft, it's a little bit difficult to disguise that. So presumably, is he kind of then, as well as keeping an eye on what the U.S. Navy is doing, he's keeping an eye on all these technological developments, all these new prototype aircraft, and then phoning up or sending a telegram, like, well, I've seen this thing,
Yeah,
this monoplane that doesn't have wires to support its wings, or this one that can retract its landing gear. Uh,
yeah,
and I suppose with a
exactly.
with a
Mhm.
with a competitive environment like that, I suppose you could also maybe go to the various manufacturers and suppliers, because obviously they're not manufacturing everything in-house. So
Mhm.
if somebody's going, oh well, I've seen a brand new, really nice flush retracting landing gear. Oh, okay, well maybe the Douglas will be reticent about telling me this, but if I go down the road to the guy who manufactures and sells them and really would like a contract to also sell them to Martin or Curtis or Vought or whoever,
Mhm.
maybe they'll tell me a bit more. They'll give me the sales pitch, or maybe they'll tell me a little bit too much, and then I can quietly squirrel that across. Is that so?
Yeah,
That's pretty much his role.
that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. But he takes it to even a better level. I mean, the fellow
Okay.
is smooth and so smart
Hmm.
that okay, he's got a house. I checked the house on the websites now.
Hmm.
It's currently worth $14 million. View of Beverly Hills and the ocean, right? And he has parties there. He invites his So he invites, the head of the Pacific Fleet,
Mhm.
a couple folks from Lockheed, and he gets them drunk and he says, gee, when I was at Jutland,
Mm.
I had this plane that could do this fast. How fast is your new plane? And you can really get a lot of information from people who think you're their friend and you're buying them drinks, right?
Mm. Okay, so it's a multi-pronged approach, and presumably the Japanese are finding this quite useful because he's there for a little while.
His salary, we benchmarked his salary with my friends in the Japanese naval forces, and it came out to 10x the salary of a Japanese admiral.
Wow. Okay.
So, they're buying him this house, so it's clearly a value to them. We've been speculating based on some of the information we found. The Japanese planes really flew very far
Mhm.
during the war, as did the American planes. And the British planes, they didn't really have this, which wasn't as much of interest, right? So,
Mhm.
what was the technology to make these planes fly very far? And a lot of it was the aluminum thing, the structures, the airframes, yeah, all these things, right? So he's getting into some really technical weeds to make the Japanese planes better.
Okay. Yeah. So, and I mean, it makes sense because if your manufacturers are making this set of advancements, and the
Yep.
Americans are doing this, and the British are doing that, everybody's going to have advantages and disadvantages in different areas. So it's not a case of the interwar, hilarious enough, Allied intelligence efforts are like, oh yes, well clearly the Japanese cannot do anything other than copy superior Western designs.
Right, right.
Um, the Japanese are going, well, this works, and this works, but maybe this bit could use some improvement. Hey, Rutland, have that lot got anything that'll help fix this bit?
Yeah,
So they're
exactly right.
combining technologies with their own innovation, not just going, please send us all the designs and we'll just copy them straight out.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot
And
more than the design for sure.
yeah. So while he's helping the Japanese Navy, you mentioned when we were talking about this earlier that he doesn't spend the entirety of the interwar period in World War II as purely a Japanese agent. So, um, presumably at some point, the fact that we're talking about this, he presumably
Mhm.
gets found out. Um,
Yeah.
so when he gets, how does he get found out, and why isn't he immediately, chucked in prison?
Yeah. Okay. He's very mysterious, and all these British actors, it shows up in the FBI reports that were declassified recently. They were he's a little bit of a mystery man. What is he doing? He was very upfront about his trips to Japan. Oh, I'm a trading company fellow. Well, what are you actually doing?
Mm.
Oh, I'm a stockbroker. Oh, okay. They're like, this is the only stockbroker I've ever met that's never tried to sell anyone any stock, right? So, but eventually it starts getting a little strange, and we don't entirely know which of the British actors it was. I believe it was this fellow named Alan Mowbray who played a butler. He was the prototypical British butler in all the 1930s films. Him and Boris Karloff were good buddies. And they appear to have gone to the FBI at some point. And the FBI started putting a tail on him, and it became a little question. So, as a British citizen, not an American citizen, before the American anti-espionage laws came in, you could argue he wasn't really committing any crimes against the U.S. And it became a legal gray area here. Um, he starts doing some strange things like this fellow shows up, the new janitor at Lockheed.
Mhm.
Okay, shows up one day, the new night janitor. He's been recommended by Frederick Rutland and Boris Karloff, used to work for Karloff. And they see he's being really strange, acting very strangely. And I'm talking about the
Mm.
janitor here.
Yeah.
The janitor is an Irish nationalist. It doesn't seem like the kind of fellow who'd be hanging out with, British actors. And if you think about it, if you're the FBI, the night janitor is really the fellow you don't want to be to be the spy running around Lockheed. He's going all over the plant, right? But they're not really finding, the smoking gun here for
Okay.
quite a long
So
time.
so they suspect, but they can't prove it, and even if they could prove it, as you say, without those anti-espionage laws, as a British
It's
citizen, he doesn't owe the American state any allegiance, so you can't charge him with treason because
it's not
he can't
American.
commit treason against the United States.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, so that they've kind of got this inkling of what happened. So, but do they eventually confront him? Because again, as we mentioned earlier, he doesn't spend his entire career as purely a Japanese agent. So how does it go from, well, we think there's something dodgy about this guy to, excuse me, what are you doing? And here are your options for, going forward with this.
Yeah. So, if you think about the global situation here,
Mhm,
all of a sudden we've got World War II started in Europe,
mhm,
and the number one priority for the British really is to get the Americans into the war.
mhm,
And clearly, the last thing in the world the British would want at this point would be for the newspapers to say Charlie Chaplin's buddy, the British war hero, is helping the Japanese steal American secrets. You do not want this out.
mhm.
Okay, the FBI doesn't want this out because this guy's been there in place since 1933. He's been there 8 years, and they've been ignoring it. I mean, this is just really, this is just, dynamite, right?
Mhm.
And so what he's done at this point is he decides, I'm going to get back to your to
Yeah.
answer your question. He actually decides, he better. It's getting more and more clear there will be a war with Japanese and American. He starts trying to become a double agent. So he approaches U.S. naval intelligence and says, "Look, I'm the guy. I know these guys. These Japanese admirals. Yamamoto and all these guys. These are my friends going back 20 years. I've been to their houses. They like me. I like them. I'm the guy that's going to help you anticipate what's going to happen." Right.
Okay. So it's kind of like he's happy to take the Japanese money, but there's still a little streak of patriotism somewhere in there, such that when the chips are down and there's one side versus the other, he's still gonna back, you know, well, the British dash allied side if they're going to face off against the Japanese.
Right. Either that or he's thinking about self-preservation,
Hmm.
or he's thinking, hey, I can make some more money.
Yeah,
It's,
I'm
it's
free.
it's some combination of these, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so eventually, what happens is the folks from I6, the FBI get together, and they're like, "What are we going to do about this guy?" The FBI is like, "We've got the goods on him. We can have
Mhm,
him shot." And
mhm,
the British say, "Well, what do you have on him?" And they don't tell them. The British say, "Like, we've got all this stuff on him, but we're not telling you, FBI guys. We don't
mhm.
trust you, right?" And so what they arrange is, right about 3 months before Pearl Harbor, they arrange to have him sort of quietly go back to Britain.
Okay.
There's At this time, there's the Battle of the Atlantic. It's really hard to get a safe ticket back to Britain. They arrange a bomber for him to fly home, and they quietly put him somewhere where he's eventually, after Pearl Harbor, he's eventually arrested.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
when in this period of where he's trying to be a double agent, did anybody listen to anything he said, or what did he say?
Yeah.
What was he trying to
So
tell them, and did anyone pay attention?
the bottom line is the FBI certainly didn't. The U.S. Navy folks, some of them did, but his plans were a little wild and maybe a little discoordinated.
Mhm,
One of the one thing was like, look, I'm going to know when the Japanese are going to attack. I know these guys. Just
mhm.
leave me in place. I'll warn you. I won't know all the details, but I will know, that
Roughly
from
when.
those faces, what's going on,
Yeah.
right? And he comes up with that, and he comes up with some other ideas. He says, look, what we can do, he talks to one of the US naval intelligence guys, says, I'm going to tell the Japanese that when the war starts, right, I can go out to the beach in Malibu, right? I'll have my little signaling light and just send a submarine over, and then I can just give them all the information. And then the US Navy can capture the Japanese submarine. What a fantastic plan. What could go wrong? Okay. And the higher ups in the US Navy are just not they're not having this, right? This just sounds like the worst idea ever, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
I mean, so they're basically not listening to him. I mean, is there anything that perhaps that he was trying to tell them that could have changed things in terms of anticipating incoming attacks, or did they never really get that far into it?
Yeah, I mean, he made the pitch, which I'm going for,
Hmm.
is that the Japanese intelligence, naval intelligence, was all been moved to Mexico by this point.
Hmm.
It's high up. You can intercept the American communications. You could hear the convoy directions, going out, and they were all there. So a bunch of the really, really good upper level Japanese Navy guys are in Mexico City. He's like, send me down there, embed me with them, and I'll know when the attack's coming,
Mm.
right? And I'll be able to tell you. They trust me.
Yeah.
And yeah, MI6 is not having this. uh, yeah,
So yeah, well, there, but for the grace of God goes another opportunity to avoid Pearl Harbor.
right. One more.
Uh,
Mhm.
yeah. So you mentioned he gets back to Britain. They kind of quietly arrest him on unspecified nebulous charges, which essentially amount to we don't like you, so we're locking you up until we
Yep.
could come up with something concrete to pin on you. Wartime emergency powers, don't you love them?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what then happens to him during and shortly after World War II?
Yeah. Well, during now, a bunch of the British admirals from World War One, specifically Admiral Keyes, Admiral Richmond, these folks, they love him, right? They don't believe this at all. And Admiral Keyes makes he's a good friend of Churchill. He calls Churchill up, says, let this guy out. Churchill's like, Roger, leave it alone, right? He doesn't take that as a no. He makes a speech in the House of Commons saying that, boy, the Royal Navy has, really blown it, by not taking this fellow seriously, and saying, look, okay, I'm not going to defend his actions, but, you know, smart guy. He knew it, you've screwed up. And this gets buried in all the wartime news, believe it or not. And eventually, they're like MI5 is now saying we got to let this guy out of jail at some point, under emergency powers. We can't let this go, forever. They're letting the British fascists, out of jail. They're like, at some point we have to let this guy go, and they try to make a deal with him. Right? We just need you to, to shut your lip, and then we will put you out there. And he's like, and he's actually saying, look, put me in charge of a small, like a landing ship or something.
Mhm.
I want to be back in the game, right? And they're not having this, right? They're just not having this at all. But they arranged for him to be let out at some point. And he's really not happy with MI5 in particular. He doesn't like these people. He's so smart that he finds out who the interrogators are. He finds out their families and where they live, and he starts writing them threatening letters. Okay.
Okay.
At that
That's a lot
point,
harder to do in the 1940s than it is today.
especially since he was in jail on the Isle of Man, which was supposed to be like to get him like
Middle of nowhere.
far away, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and all of a sudden, his brother-in-law is getting put in jail for tax evasion. You know, but anyway, he doesn't get very far with his nefarious plots here to get even. And at some point, he's he's a very bitter man, and yeah, he commits suicide,
Hmm. Officially, at least.
at least officially.
Yeah. Um, okay. Well, that's kind of the if you like the professional career spectrum of Rutland, and I suppose the final question would be, having obviously looked into him and what he did and what his efforts were worth to the Japanese in a lot more detail
Mhm.
than probably anyone else has at this point. Um, where do you think he sits on that? That, I mean, it's very reductive, but that classic kind of hero to villain line in that, he probably contributed a reasonable amount to the development of the Imperial Japanese Navy, so
Yeah.
and particularly its air services. So some of their effectiveness in World War II against the Allies could be attributed to him, but as we've
Mhm.
just discussed, at the same time, he was desperately towards the latter stages of all this trying to rectify that, but for the reticence of the intelligence agencies. So, where would you put him?
Yeah, no one's going to claim he was a good guy here.
Mm,
Okay, I certainly won't. I'm more sympathetic to him than most. There were plenty of other Japanese spies in Britain. Notably Lord Sempill,
mhm,
who may have done more damage at some point. There's a hilarious episode where some MI5 is tapped Sempill's phone and doesn't understand what's going on, and he realizes he doesn't understand what's going on because both sides of the conversation are in Japanese. Sempill's got a Japanese butler who's talking to the Japanese Navy guy. Yeah, so um, you know, it's not absolutely clear
mhm.
on the hero to villain spectrum.
Fair enough.
Hmm.
And I suppose, if people want to look into this in more detail, because we've been talking for about an hour with a little bit of background going in there as well, but you've, as we said, obviously have looked into this a lot more. So if people want to learn a lot more in detail about what was going on and maybe make their own judgments, how can they do that? Is there a book that they can read?
Well, absolutely, there is. Yes, it's fairly newly published. It's been out
Hmm.
for a month. It's called The Beverly Hills Spy,
Hmm.
and available wherever your books can be found. And if you're interested, please check it out.
Okay, awesome. Well, links in the description below for people to find that book and have a look. And hopefully, as people read it and complete it, they'll have hopefully leave some comments below what they think, um, where he sits on the grand scheme of things. And so, yeah, well, thank you very much because this is
Thank you.
it's a very new line of research, as you said. You're bringing Japanese sources that we haven't really had before in English to light. And it's an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the career, shady or otherwise, of somebody
Yeah,
who perhaps 10 years ago, if you'd asked people what did Rutland do, they'd be like, well, he flew a seaplane over the Germans, and that was about it. um, uh, so it's a new aspect of history that's being unlocked. So thanks very much to Ron
cool.
Drabkin, our special guest, and yeah, let us know what you think in the comments below about the whole situation. And should the FBI and MI6 actually have listened to him for a change? You never know; it might have helped. So
You might
see
help.
you, see you later,
Yep.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.